Gonna try. All right, so we'll say good morning, good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share, to thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, Tilsim Shach Havaretz Yisrael, for dedicating all Shumer and Joshua this year in the schus of Besoros Tovos for all of Am Yisrael. Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Habali and Latova Ben Goldberg, for Aliyah ben Neshama of his parents, Avram ben Asher Pinchas, Fegar Ezel Bas Zelig, in the hope that the tefillos of our Kilin, all of Am Yisrael, are answered. And our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Elul, Shmuel Libudinovitz, Le'ili Nishmas, David Flum's father, Rabbi Ari Flum, Rabbi Yitzchak Ari ben Chav, Rabbi Yaakov Zichron Livracha. We will say today's daf is Hey 5, but we are picking up Mamish, top of Daled Amud days. A lot to do today, and we're going to get it done. Emir Hashem. So the Gemara says as follows: literally the top. The Afagav the Tarti Lav Dafka. Tarti Mia Dafka. Supposed to just reorient ourselves for literally a second. So remember again, in yesterday's daf, we really had the fantastic sugya on Amud Aleph, discussing the idea of how we know that every step of the carbonic process, shchita, kabbalah, zrika, holacha, have to be done what we call l'shem kachim, for the purpose of the particular carbon. We then transitions to the topic of how we know that each of the steps has to be done for the sake of the particular owner. So the Gemara said, essentially we're trying to learn one from the other, and the Gemara says, but there are four distinctions. The afagav the tarti lav dafka, tarti mia dafka. Even though two of the distinctions are not necessarily so specific and explicit, two of them are maishna shin. For example, the Gemara says maishna shinui bailim delo havi psula begufo. Remember again, on one hand, shinui bailim is not really a psul in the actual carbon itself. In other words, nothing changes in the identity of the carbon. So it's really just a different thought, a different mindset. The Gemara says, well, in truth, shinui kodesh nami machshavas machshav ba'amahu. You can say the same thing about shinui kodesh. Change of carbonic designation is also really just a thought and not something physical in the carbon. Elakiv and the achshava psula, but in the say by shinui carbon, since a change in mental designation ultimately affects the carbon, hachanami given the achshava pasla, so too when you have a change in the mental designation of the owner, that also negatively impacts the carbon. And according to Rabbi Pinchas Beid Rav Mari, who says that there's shinui bailin even after the death of the owner. And I will say again, so we spoke about this before a little bit yesterday, that let's say again, Reuven was going to bring a shlamim, he died. So his children could bring the shlamim on his behalf, right? The only carbon that you really can't bring posthumously is a chatas or an asham, a sin offering. But other carbonos you could bring you can't bring it posthumously, but your children can bring it. So you could have shinui bailin even after you die. So the Gemara says, Tarti miha ika lemifrach. Ultimately, again, there are still two other cases which would stand. Ella amarav ashi amakra. Sefer Rav Ashi is like this. So remember again, we're asking now, how do we know that the din of shinui bailin, namely that you can't change the designation, you should not cognitively change the designation of the actual owner of the carbon during any steps of the carbonic process. Shchita, kabbalah, zrika, holach, or holacha zrika. So the pasuk says, "V'nir tzalo lechaper alav v'lo al chavero." Good, pretty simple drasha. Pasuk says, "It shall be accepted for him to atone for him and not his friend." Who's the him? The owner of the carbon. So from here you see you should not change the designation of the carbon. The Gemara says, one second, but is that what that pasuk is used for? It's needed for another drasha. What's the drasha? Benir tzlo lechaper alav. That same pasuk, Rabbi Shimon Omer, es sha'alav chai b'achri yuso, ve'es she'enu alav enu chai b'achri yuso. That teaches us a different halacha, Rabosai. That what happens if you designate a carbon and ultimately something happens to the carbon? If you took personal responsibility, es sha'alav, if it's upon you, ultimately, I think Gemara says, for example, a neder, right? A neder is a person says, hare alai, I hereby take upon this obligation upon me. If something then happens to the carbonic animal, you are obligated to go ahead and replace it. On the other hand, if you bring in a dava, a gift offering, and a dava is hare zu, this animal is a carbon. Well, if something happens to the animal, then what? Then halacha l'maisa again, you are not obligated to go ahead and replace it. My time, what's the reason? Kevan the amra alai Kimandaton le akasve dami. Because when you say alai, it is as if literally again you're putting that animal on your shoulders and you are obligated for responsibility. So we're using the pasuk of something different, to which the Gemara says Ravashi mivenirtza lo lechaper ka'amar. Ravashi is darshaning the first part of the pasuk venirtza lo. He's not darshaning a love. So if Rabbi say, it turns out that halacha l'maisa, the pasuk itself is teaching me two halachas. Number one, venirtza lo lechaper teaches me that during every step of the carbonic process, the processes must be done for the sake of the intended owner. Now that's the chatila. Obviously, as we've seen, b'di eved, the carbon still may be kosher depending on the carbon. The last phrase, alav, or the last word, alav, teaches me that when I take a neder, if something happens to the animal, I am obligated to replace it. If it's in a dava, ultimately I'm not obligated to replace it. Difference between a neder and an adava. A neder is hare alai. I take it upon me. If I take it upon me, if something happens to the animal, I have a replacement obligation. Nedava hare zu. Something happens to the animal, I'm not obligated to replace it. Incredible. So ashkechan zvicha as well. So interestingly enough, this entire exercise tells me fine. So now I know that I have to shecht the animal for the sake of the intended owner. The Gemara says Kabbalah. Ashkechan zvicha uzrika. So now I know shechting and zrika. Kabbalah minayin. What about Kabbalah? What about Kabbalah? The chitema leilef in zvicha uzrika. Smeishish learn now from zvicha and zrika. Malis zvicha uzrika shekein avodah shechayron labachutz. First of all, shrita and zrika are sacrificial rites that there's liability for if you do it outside of the Beis Hamikdash. So therefore, you can't learn out from there. Ela amrav ashi asya me'el nazir. Interestingly enough, we learn out from the ram of the nazir. It's one of the karbanos that the nazir brings at the end of his Nazirite vow. The chsiv ve'es ha'ayil ya'aseh zevach shlamim. Interesting. The pasuk says he shall do the ayil zevach shlamim. What does this mean? Shetei asiyaso l'shem shlamim. Teaching us that when the ram of the nazir is offered, it must be offered up for the sake of shlamim. Now, if I don't need that to teach me about carbonic designation itself, because we've already learned that, ultimately, use it to teach me about owner designation, that there must be explicit owner designation for this stage of the carbon. So now Rav Acha bar Abba asks in the drush. He says, why don't you say like this? Ema yasa klal. Say that the word yasa as a klal. Zevach prat. Klal uprat. Ein bechlal elamash beprat. So we'll say, remember, whenever you have a klal and a prat, so ultimately, again, the klal itself is going to be limited by the prat. So the Gemara says, Zvicha in midiachrin alo. Maybe it only teaches me shchita and nothing else. Iksiv ya'aseh shlamim zevach kidika amrit. If it would have been phrased, he shall do a shlamim as a carbon, then I would agree with that. Hashta dichsiv ya'aseh zevach shlamim havile klal she'eno moles. This is very interesting. Just that phraseology makes it essentially an interrupted klalu pratu klal. The word zevach ultimately breaks up the pasuk. And any klal that is not complete is not darshan as a klal uprat. Ravina says the olam danin. Really, Ravina says it does work. The Gemara says v'la Hashem chazer v'kalal. The la Hashem at the end makes it actually a klal uprat uklal. How could that be? Because the first klal doesn't mirror the last klal. Ultimately, again, the first klal ultimately, again, seems to indicate that anything involved in the carbon, even not the primary avodos, has to be done l'shma. But ultimately, just the opposite. The first klal ultimately, again, indicates to us only the sacrificial rites. Klal basra kol laHashem afilu shvichu shirayim v'aktaras emurin. The last klal would seem to indicate that anything involved in the carbon, even the spilling out of the leftover blood, ultimately again has to be the shema. So even if you want to darshan a klalu pratu klal, the two bookends don't match. The Gemara says, Hatan Rabbi Shmuel, bechlal prati darish ki agavna. That's okay, because again, the Shir Rabbi Shmuel, they were darshan a klalu pratu klal even like this. Even if the first klal and the second klal didn't exactly mirror each other, they would still darshan it. So Gemara says, klal u'pratu klal, iyata dan elikeina prat. Now, whenever you have a klal u'pratu klal, so remember again, the prat is there ultimately to help modify the klal. Maha prat mefurash avoda uba'ina lishma. Just like the prat is talking about one of the sacrificial rites and it has to be done lishma. Af kol avoda uba'ina lishma. So to any part of the sacrificial service has to be done lishma. Imaha prat mefurash avoda v'chayaven aleh b'chutz. Af kol avoda v'chayaven aleh b'chutz. So again, but I could also say, just like the prat is talking about navoda, that you're chayiv if you do it outside of the Beis HaMikdash, so maybe the din of lishma should only apply to any avoda that can't be done outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Shchita uzrika in, that would apply to shchita, slaughtering, zrika, sprinkling, but kabbalah v'halacha lo, but technically speaking, kabbalah and halacha done outside of the Beis HaMikdash, ultimately again, would not be problematic. Inami maha prat mufurash davar hata'o. You could also say the prat maybe only refers to something that needs to be done on the northern side of the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, and only applies to chatos that are done in the pnimius, on the inside of the kodesh. Af kol haton safim v'yeshem bechatos hapnimios. Shchita v'kabbalah in zrika lo. That would include shchita and kabbalah, but not zrika. So the truth is the drasha could go either way. What do you do when you can do the drasha either way? So therefore, essentially accept both drashas. Another possibility is chada v'chada teku b'milsa. Each one, I will say it's interesting, teku over here is not a classic teku. Right? What it means is each one is able to stand on its own, and therefore each are correct. Okay, ibais. Another possibility is zrika midravashi nafka. It's possible also that zrika is learned out. The din of zrika l'shma is learned out from the drasha of Rav Ashi, as we saw before. So ashkichan al nazir, the Gemara says shar shlamim. So now I know about el nazir. What about the rest of general shlamim? Maybe you should say they're not from El Nazir. Mali El Nazir shekein yesh imahen damim achirim. El Nazir is different because there are other blood services included in that. Rashi says sheba'in imo chatas va'ola. There's a chatas and an ola that accompanies the ayal of the Nazir. Imke nichtov shalmei. My shlamim. Why does it say shlamim like that, like in the plural? Kol shlamim comes to include all shlamim, that all shlamim have a din of lishma. First white line, ashkechan shlamim, shar kol kachim minalon. So now I know that all shlamim have a din ultimately again of lishma. What about the rest of karbanos? V'chitim and elif mishlamim. Maybe I'll learn out from shlamim. Ma shlamim shekin tu'unin smicha unisachim. Utnufas chazeh v'shok. 1 second. But shlamim are different. Why? Because all shlamim require ultimately smicha, leaning on the carbon, nisachim, wine libations, tnufa, and a waving of the leg and the chest. There's something unique. So it says you can learn that all karbanos, ela amakra, zos hatorah, li'ola, lemincha, u'lechatas, u'le'asham, ve'lamiluim, ve'lazevach hashlamim. Hikishin hakasav l'shlamim. The Torah equates all karbanos to shlamim. Mashlamim bein shinui kodesh bein shinui bailim ba'ina l'shma. Af kol bein shinui kodesh bein shinui bailim ba'in l'shma. So that's it. So therefore, the Gemara once you've established that ultimately again the din of l'shma applies to shlamim, the Torah then goes ahead and equates all other karbanos to shlamim. And just like shlamim require l'shma, remember again there are two types of l'shma. There's what's called lishma for kodesh and lishma for bailim. Lishma for kodesh means that when you offer up a karban, you have to have in mind, you have to intend for the particular type of karban, right? Just like shlamim needs it, all other karbanos need it. So too, you have to have lishma for bailim, ownership lishma. You have to offer up the karban with the intention for the particular owner. Incredible. Ema, heicha d'shachat lehu shalol lishma. So good. Both say. So by the way, so that's the end. That's the end. Now what we've successfully established is that there is again this twofold lishma. You have to have what we call karbanic lishma and ownership lishma. You have to have in mind during all of the avodas, shchita, kabbalah, zrika, holacha. You have to have in mind for the particular karban, and you have to have in mind for the particular owner in each of those steps as well. That's what we've established in the last block. Now the Gemara asks a very interesting question. So the Gemara says, well, 1 second. Now, the principle that we started this Masechta with a couple of days ago is, although you're supposed to have Lishma, what's the halacha if you don't have Lishma? What's the halacha? the carbon is kosher, but it doesn't count towards the owner's obligation. So the Gemara says, why? If we just established that lishma is a necessary carbonic criteria, both for the sake of the carbon, for carbonic designation and for ownership, so why don't we say if you don't have lishma, then what? The carbon's pasul. It's totally no good. So the Gemara says, the carbon should be pasul once you go ahead and offer it up shalol lishma amakra motzas vasecha tishmar vasisa kasher nadarta. So this is very interesting. So the pasuk says motzas vasecha tishmar. So whatever you utter, right, make sure to honor the utterances of your lips. Vasisa kasher nadarta, and you shall go ahead and do as you vowed. Now, the end of the pasuk is that kasher nadarta Nedava asher nadarta beficho. The nedava, the gift offering that you spoke out with your mouth. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. The pasuk itself is confusing. What's confusing about it? Because the pasuk begins by talking about ultimately again a neder, and then at the end of the pasuk it switches over to a nedava. So what's going on over here? So the Gemara says, Hi nedava nederhu. Why is he calling it a nedava at the end of the pasuk? It's a neder. Ella, here we go. Im kamash nadarta asisi yehi neder v'im lav yehi nedava. Teach us a very important halacha, that if you executed on what you intended to do, then it fulfills your neder. But if not, it's in a dava. Or in other words, what the pasuk is teaching me is like this. If I offered up a carbon for the intended purpose, i.e. lishma, then the carbon is going to count for its intended purpose. But if for some reason you had a deviation in lishma, the carbon will still be effective, albeit in a different way. It won't be the neder, it won't be the obligatory offering that you were going to bring, but it'll count as an adava. So from here we see that if you lack lishma, the carbon itself is still a valid carbon, but does not go ahead and satisfy your particular obligation. Again, so we'll say, so one more time. Motzah sasecha tishmar. When you're going to bring a carbon, ultimately go ahead and honor the carbon by bringing it for the correct designation. Kasher nadarta, as you promised, as you said you were going to. But if you did not do that, the end of the pasuk says, right? It becomes an adava. It becomes a gift offering. So therefore, again, still kosher, but doesn't count towards your obligation. Incredible. So we'll say, interestingly enough, now it appears that we have two psukim, because the Gemara earlier quoted a different pasuk. So it appears now that we have two different psukim to highlight this same idea. The Gemara says, why do you need both? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. If the pasuk would have just said motzah top of hay, lo yada b'may kasav rachmana zos haTorah, I would not have known ultimately again what the pasuk of zos haTorah is referring to. Because of rachmana zos haTorah, if the pasuk would have just written the pasuk of zos haTorah, have amina lipsalo, I would have said ultimately again when there is a lack of lishma, perhaps the carbon is pasul. In other words, not only does it not count towards my obligation, but let me say it's an invalid carbon. Therefore, kasav rachmana motzah sasecha. So I'll say, so interestingly enough, essentially the Gemara is actually is like this. The first pasuk Zos HaTorah really teaches me the idea that lishma is really necessary. But from that pasuk, I would have thought that the absence of lishma fundamentally invalidates the carbon. Comes the pasuk of motzah sasecha and teaches me that no, the absence of lishma does not invalidate the carbon. In other words, the carbon doesn't count towards my obligation, but it's still a valid carbon. Incredible. So the Gemara says, fine. Rami Reish Lakish, it's very interesting. Rami Reish Lakish, Ohi B'midrasha Umakshi. Reish Lakish was lying on his stomach in the Beis Medrash, and he went ahead and raised the following question. Okay, this is how he was positioned in the Beis Medrash, and he asked the following question: Im ksherim heim yirtzu v'im ein maratzin lama ba'in. So we'll say, so just you should know, it's interesting. Why is he on his stomach? So there's a halacha that says that Talmidei Chachamim who live in the Beis Medrash, are allowed to take like short naps inside of the Beis Medrash. People think that this applies to balabatim also, but it is not true. Actually, some are machmir to take long naps. Right? It's not true. So Talmidei Chachamim who live in the base, literally whose lives in the Beis Medrash, so they have the ability to. So it could very well be that what's happening over here is Abaye is laying down, so to speak, for a moment. But what's incredible to see is that even if he's lying down, so you'll say, what makes a person a Talmid Chacham? It's not the amount of Torah that you learn; it's the preoccupation with Torah. That even if Abaye is going ahead, and trying to, catch a few moments just to relax for a few moments, even then he's still asuk batorah. He's lying on his stomach, but at the end of the day, he's still asuk batorah, which is quite beautiful. So he asked the following question: Im ksherim hem yirtzu ve'im ein meratzin lama boim. So Abaye says this doesn't make sense, right? If you tell me like, I'm sorry, Rish Lakish, I'm sorry. This doesn't make sense. Why? Because if at the end of the day, the carbon is a valid carbon, then it should count towards the owner's obligation. And if it doesn't count towards the owner's obligation, then it shouldn't be a valid carbon. So Rish Lakish is asking, I don't understand, either a carbon is good or it's not good. And if it's good, it should be good for everything. And if it's not good, it should be invalid for everything. To which the Gemara says, Matzino b'ba'in la'achar misa. It's not true. We do find this designation by carbonos that halacha l'maisa, sometimes a carbon could be a valid carbon, but it doesn't count towards the obligation of the owner. For example, there are certain carbonos that are brought posthumously. So obviously, a posthumous carbon is a valid carbon, but obviously doesn't count towards the obligation of the owner. Why not? The owner's dead. So the Gemara says, Disnan. We learned Ha'isha Shevia Chatas Umesa. Supposed to say this is about a woman who's bringing her karbanos after childbirth. So remember again. Let's say so Rachel gave birth, she brought her chatas, then she died. So what's the halacha? Umesu Yavia Yershna Lasa. Ultimately, again, her children, her orphans, could bring her ola. So the Gemara says, interestingly enough, that halacha l'maisa again. So an ola is one of the childbirth karbanos. Right? So halacha l'maisa again. What do you see from here? Her children can bring her carbon. Now, obviously, what's the nature of that carbon? It's a valid carbon. Does it work for Rachel? No, Rachel's dead. So the Gemara says, now, obviously, this only works by an ola, doesn't work for the chatas. So, for example, she brought her ola, then died. Her children can't bring her chatas, right? There is no such thing as a posthumous chatas. So we'll say, but the point over here, so what do you see? They say back to Rish Lakish, what do you see? You see from it, there is a concept that a carbon could be a valid carbon, but doesn't count towards the owner's obligation. So listen, so to which Rish Lakish says, I'll agree with you with Ola, right? Because an Ola could be brought after death. But Asham Delo Asila Achar Misa, Minalan. What about an Asham, for example? So Rish Lakish says, what about an Asham? So Asham can't be brought after death. Yes, Rish Lakish says, according to our Mishnah, you could go ahead and bring in Asham, right? If Reuben had to bring in Asham, but he had a mind for an Ola, the halach is that what? That the carbon is a valid carbon, but doesn't count towards his obligation. I don't understand that. Amarle, to which they respond back to Rish Lakish. Rabbi Lezer responds back, Hari machlok sabitzido. There's another sheet. Rabbi Lezer Omer afa asham. Rabbi Lezer says that an asham is treated like a chatas, namely that an asham is actually an example of a carbon that if brought shalom lishma is totally invalid. Rish Lakish gets upset. Amar zeu she'omer alav adam gadolu. This Rabbi Eliezer, this is who people say is a great Talmid Chacham. What kind of answer is that? The Gemara says, Kamina ana Mishnah Shlema, va'at amrat li Rabbi Eliezer. I'm asking the Tanakama. Right? The Tanakama has espouses a principle. What's the principle? Any carbon that you bring the Shema, the carbon is valid, but it doesn't count towards the owner. And in the Tanakama's model, there are only two carbonos excluded from that rule. What are the two carbonos? Chatos and carbon Pesach. But according to the Tanakama, Asham works. I'm asking according to the Tanakama, don't give me the Shita of Rabbi Eliezer. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Eliezer, so we'll say, so again, so just appreciate. Here's Rish Lakish's kasha, which is a good kasha. Rish Lakish says, I don't understand. If you're telling me now that a carbon should be offered up l'shma, right? Rabbi said, let's just retrace our steps for a moment. Rish Lakish said, you told me that a carbon should be offered up l'shma. Two forms of l'shma. The Shema, for the sake of the designated carbonic, for the specific carbonic designation, and the Shema for the particular owner designation. Okay, we've also established that if you don't offer it the Shema, what's the halacha? The carbon itself is still valid, but doesn't count towards the owner's obligation. Reish Lakish just simply says, I don't understand that. If the carbon is a valid carbon, it should count towards the owner, for the owner's obligation. And if it doesn't count towards the owner's obligation, then what? It shouldn't be a valid carbon. So now Rish Lakish, Eftach ana paschal nafshai. Rish Lakish literally says, literally translated, I will make an opening for my own neshama. Which means that what? I'm going to answer my own question. Which I will say, by the way, is a profound idea. In life, sometimes it is better to try to answer your own questions and not wait for others, and figure it out yourself. Like most things in life, Learn to become self-reliant. Even when it comes to your great life questions, should you seek out ethos? Should you seek out insight from others? Of course. But more often than not, if we're honest, all the answers I need to the great complexities of my life, especially when they're personalistic questions, the answers are inside of me. I just have to be brave enough to look inward. So the Gemara says as follows. Reish Lakish says, here's the answer. Motzos vasecha, hai nidava nederhu kidleel. Reish Lakish says the answer is as we saw before. It's the pasuk that we spoke about. The pasuk says, Motzos vasecha tishmar, vasisa kasher nadarta. The pasuk when bringing a carbon, right? Literally, again, honor your right. Do what you're supposed to do. And if you do what you're supposed to do, bring it l'shma, then it'll be ultimately, again, a neder. But if you don't, it'll become a nedava. How the pasuk is talking about neder? Why does it switch to nedava? As we just said, it's teaching us to halacha. If you bring the carbon l'shma, then ultimately, again, it will be halacha l'maisa, your neder. But if you don't bring it l'shma, then at least it's a nedava, which means it's a valid carbon, but doesn't count towards your obligation. That's the source. That's the source. I will say, incredible. Yosef, Rabbi Zeirav, Rabbi Yitzchak, Rabbi Yosef, Abai, Gavaihu. So all these Rabbanim are sitting together. Vyasi v'kamri, Kashli Reish Lakish, Asham. So Reish Lakish's problem was Asham, right? It was really carbon Asham. The lo asi la'achamisa, v'nosiv le'tamuda mosas sasecha. Because Asham on one hand is not brought posthumously, yet we want to apply the principle or the rule of Motzos Vasecha Tishmar to an Asham. Ema haba b'neder b'nedav laisi v'lo lirtzi. Asham lo laisi klal. So we'll say, so in reality, we should say like this, that a carbon that can be brought as a neder and as an nedava, if brought lo lishma, ultimately, I will say laisi means it should be accepted as a carbon, v'lo lirtzi, but does not work towards the particular owner. Asham, but maybe an Asham is different, because at the end of the day, an Asham cannot be brought as a neder or a nedava, so maybe lo laisi klal. Maybe if an Asham is brought lishma, it should not work at all. Reish Lakish mehacha pasach. Reish Lakish really answers from the following: V'shachat osa lechatas. Pasuk says you will shecht for a chatas. Osa lishma kshera shelo lishma psula. It is only a chatas. By the way, I was saying, remember again, I mentioned this. The Tanakama from the beginning excludes chatas from this principle, right? The Tanakama espouses a principle. What's the principle? If you are, right, the principle, really the unwritten part of the principle is every single carbon has to be offered up l'shma. And there are two pieces to l'shma. L'shma of the carbonic designation, l'shma of the owner. If you don't offer up the carbon l'shma, what's the halacha? What's the halacha? Carbon is valid, doesn't count towards the owner. The Tanakama excludes carbon pesach and chatas. But yet we never explained why those are excluded. Here it is. I will say, why is chatas excluded? Because by chatas it says, v'shachat osa lechatas. Right? The pasuk says, you shall shecht it as a chatas. What do we darshan from here? Osa lishma kshera, shelo lishma psula. A chatas, if shechted for the sake of a chatas, will be kosher. If it's not shechted for the sake of a chatas, it will be pasul. What do you see from here? Hashar kachim shelo lishma ksherin. By other karbanos, even if they're offered up shelo lishma, they're still going to be kosher. That's it. That's the limud. That's the limud by chatos. Yachol yirtzu. You might have thought therefore should count towards the owner as well. Tamulon motzas sasecha. Therefore the Gemara quotes the pasuk motzas sasecha. Ve'ema haba b'neder unadavalai sivelo lirtzi. Asham nami artsuye nami lirtzi. Maybe ultimately again, the pasuk teaches me that something that we brought as a neder and a dava, if brought lishma, can be accepted as a carbon, but doesn't work for the owner. Maybe an asham should even work for the owner. Rabbi asham demirtzi lo matzis amris. No, that doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense. You can't say that an asham brought lo lishma will go ahead and work to affect the owner's obligation. Why not? Kavachomer me'ola ma'ola she'en mechaperes in maratza, an ola which doesn't affect kapara, which is considered to be a high level. If brought shalom lishma, ultimately again it's a valid carbon, but doesn't work towards the owner's obligation. Asham shemechaper eno din she'en maratza, an asham ultimately again that does provide kapara, certainly if brought lishma can't count towards the owner's obligation. Ayuma ola shekin kala, but ola is different. The ola is totally burnt to the mizbeach. Shlamim yochichu. Ultimately, shlamim will show. Ma shlamim shekin tu'unin nesachin u'tinufas chazei v'shok. Shlamim is different. Why? Because shlamim requires nesachim, wine libations, and waving of the chest and thigh. Ola tochiach. So ola will prove it. V'chazra din lori zekri. V'lori zekri. They're really dissimilar. Zeh tzad hashava shaba. And what's the common denominator? Shehin kachim u'shacht. All of them are karbanos. Ushachtan shalol l'shman ksherin ve'ein meratzin. And ultimately, again, if you shach them shalol l'shma, the carbon is valid, but they do not work towards the owner's obligation. Af ani avi asham shu kodesh, so too I will go ahead and include an asham, which is a carbon. As shachtu shalol l'shma kasha ve'ein maratza. So too an asham, which also is a carbon. Ultimately, again, if a shechted shalom l'shma is a valid carbon, but does not work towards the owner's obligation. 1 second. So, but 1 second, maybe the common denominator is that all of them can be brought in at tzibur. The Gemara says, as opposed to an asham which can't. Toda tochiach. No, because Toda will show you that's not true. Because Toda can't be brought in at tzibur. We'll say, Amud Beis, ma le-toda shekein tuna lechem lechem. Toda is different, because remember, a carbon Toda comes with those 40 loaves. The Gemara says, Ola ushlamim yochichu. V'chazra din, second line, 5b. V'chazra din, lo rezekri zev, lo rezekri zev. What's the common denominator? Tzara shav shabahen, shein kadshim, shein kadshim, v'shachat shalol v'shman kasha ve'ena maratza. The common denominator amongst all these carbonos is what? That if you shach them shalol v'shma, the carbon is effective, but ultimately, again, does not count towards the owner. Afani avi asham, so too I will include asham in this. Shu kodesh v'shachto shalol l'shmo kasha ve'en marata. So too an asham, ultimately, again, if shachted shalol l'shmo, halacha l'maisa, again, it works, and ultimately, again, but does not work towards the owner's obligation. I says the Gemara 1 second. Maybe the common denominator amongst all these other karbanos will say is what? That technically speaking, they could all be brought as a neder and a nedava, and therefore that obviously would exclude asham, which cannot be brought as a neder and a nedava. Ela amarava zos haTorah. Therefore, the pasuk says zos haTorah. This is the Torah of again. It will say the pasuk over here is zos haTorah, the ola, the mincha, the chatas, the asham, the lamiluim, or the zevach hashlamim. So we'll say that pasuk is really incredible. I mean, every pasuk is incredible, but that pasuk is really incredible. Why? Because what does that pasuk do? It brings all of karbanos together. It brings all of karbanos together. So the Gemara says, "Ikisha kasav l'shlamim," and I will say, interestingly enough, if you look at the way the pasuk reads, it's ola mincha chatas asham lemiluim ula zevach hashlamim. So it's almost as if it's taking all of the initial karbanos and comparing them to shlam. And I will say, this is a very important pasuk. The Gemara says, "Ma shlamim shein kadshim ushachtan shalol l'shman ksherin." So just like shlamim. If you go ahead and you shecht it, shalol l'shma, and I will say, remember too, right? When we say shalol l'shma, what are we referring to? Both types of l'shma. L'shma for carbonic designation, l'shma for ownership designation. So just like by shlamim, if you shecht it shalol l'shma ksherin ve'ein meratzin, the carbon is good, but yet what? It doesn't work towards the owner. Afani avi asham shuhu kodesh. So too ultimately, again, I will bring in asham, the same idea. Asham is kodesh, and therefore Allah l'maisef offered shalol l'shma, either designation of or either form of l'shma. The carbon works, but ultimately, again, is not effective towards the owner. So the Gemara says, 1 second. My chaz is that, so we'll say, I just want to, okay, let's finish up a little bit. My chaz is the akshis l'shlamim. Why is it that we are comparing this ultimately again to shlamim? Akish l'chatos. Why not compare all karbanos to chatas? Now, I will say, that would be a very scary comparison. Why? Because what's the halacha by chatas offered up l'shma, right? Everyone agrees it's not good. The carbon itself is invalid. So why not say that all karbanos are karbanos? Why do you compare all karbanos to shlamim? Why don't you compare all karbanos to chatas? To which the Gemara says, no. Hamit rachmana osa. No, I will say, because remember again, the Torah already excluded chatas. How so? Because the pasuk is samach asyado al rosh chatas v'shachat osa l'chatas. Rabbi say that is there are a couple of key psukim that we have in today's daf. That's one of them. V'shachat osa chatas l'chatas. What does that teach me? That a chatas has a stricter din of lishma. That a chatas is only valid if mamish shechted lishma for chatas. But again, the Torah explicitly articulates that by chatos and not by other karbanos. And therefore, halacha l'maisa again, I will say chatos is its own thing. But I will say, but why is that pasuk important for us? Because that pasuk is the source of the din in the Mishnah. That's why everyone agrees if you shech the chatos shalol l'shma. What's the halacha? The carbon is totally invalid, right? It's not an effective carbon, and it certainly doesn't count for the owner. Why? That phrase, v'shachat osa lechatas. V'lo mi'et rachmana osa, ha mi'et rachmana osa. Good. So I'll say, so I just want to point out, if we pause here for just this, literally just a moment, just to catch up for just a second. So far, I just want to show you what we've amassed today, because this has been an earth-shattering day. Right? Number one, we established the two different categories ultimately of lishma. Right? That's number one. Number two, right? Lishma by carbonic designation, ownership designation. Both are, and where does that apply? All four of the primary sacrificial avodos: shchita, kabbalah, zrika, holacha. That was step one. Although that was really yesterday's stuff, but we won't talk about that, right? Right. So that was step one. Step two. The concept that the Mishnah espoused, that when you go ahead and you offer up a carbon shalom lishma, the carbon is an effective carbon, but does not count towards the owner. Where do you get that from? Shabbosai, it all comes down to literally, again, one pasuk. Motza svasecha tishmar. This is Dvarim. I really need glasses. Dvarim chav gimel mem dalet, right? Motza svasecha tishmar vasisa kasher nadarta laHashem elokecha. Ultimately, again, the pasuk says, right? Literally, Moses, whatever you articulate, make sure to honor it. Make sure to honor it as you vowed to Hashem your God. Nidova kasher dibarta, a gift offering like you spoke. The Gemara says, what's going on over here? We start talking about a neder, and then you switch to a nidova. Oh, that's our case. Our case is where you set out to offer up a particular carbon, and then what happened? You changed the lishma designation. Oh, so in that case, what happens? Your neder becomes an adava, which is another way of saying what? Which is another way of saying that halacha l'maisa, ultimately your carbon is still going to be a valid carbon, an adava, but it's not going to count to yours obligation. So we'll say that's the pasuk. That's the pasuk. Last piece we got today. Ultimately, if a chatas is offered up shalom l'shma, it totally does not work. Where do we get that from? Chatas la'Hashem. Right? Or what was lashon? That wasn't the v'shachat osa. No, I'm sorry. V'shachat osa lechatas. You shall go and offer it up as a chatas, which means again, I will say a chatas has even a more intense din of lishma, that if offered up shalom lishma, doesn't work at all. I will say that's the entire sugya just in those three tenets. That's it. But again, three major pillars upon everything that we're learning is built on those three pillars. Good. So we'll say let's go back to. We have a few minutes left. The Gemara says as follows. Yasser Rav Huna Rav Nachman. Yasser Sheshes Kabayu. Rav Huna Rav Nachman are sitting. Rav Sheshes is with them. The Yassi coming. And they sat and they're saying the following: Kashi the Reish Lakish Asham the Lo Asili de Misa. So remember again, Reish Lakish, when he's on his stomach in the base medrash, right? What was he bothered by? He was bothered by the asham. That's really what he was bothered by, right? Because the asham can't be brought posthumously, nor can it be brought as a neder and a dava. So it seems to be like, why does it fit in the category of other karbanos that if brought lishma still works as a carbon, but ultimately again still works as a carbon, but it doesn't count towards the owner. Lema lei Rabbi Elazar, asham nami asala chamisa. It's not true. Maybe an asham could also be brought after death. Amar luhu Rav Sheshes, asham lemakarav lemosara. So we'll say, what does it mean that asham can be brought after death? Really, an asham can't be brought after death. So what does that mean? And we'll say, if you have an asham, let's say you have an asham, and Reuben was supposed to bring an asham, and then Reuben died. What do you do with his asham? You let it graze, develop a mum, then redeem it, and use the money for other kabbanos. So in that respect, interestingly enough, technically speaking, an asham is brought after death. To which the Gemara says, no, that's not real. In other words, it's not the asham that's brought after death. It's the value of the asham that's ultimately again redeemed. Karva mosara. So I'll say, so the truth is, because if that's the case, you can say the same thing as a chatos, right? If the owner of the chatos dies and ultimately goes ahead, what happens? You let the chatos graze, develop a mum, and then go ahead and halacha l'maisa sell it off. So you can say, oh, a chatos is also brought after death. L'mosara means that the residual value is brought, but that's not really called the chatas itself. Chatas avagav the karva mosara meit rachmano. You can't bring a right from chatas. Why? Because we'll say again, even technically speaking, though the value of the chatas is brought, halacha l'maisa. Remember again, the Torah already gives its exclusion by chatas. Again, I keep on forgetting the pasuk. V'shachat osa lechatas. Asham nami ksiv behu. But it also says who by an asham, to which the Gemara says hahula achar haktaras emurim hu dichsiv. That's talking about after the limbs are offered up. Kidisanyo aval asham lo ne'emar bohu elal achar haktaras emurin. V'hu atzmo im lo iktiru emurin kasher. And so I will say ultimately again by asham, halacha l'maisa again that's really talking about after the burning of the limbs, and technically speaking, even if that is omitted, ultimately the covenant is still going to be kosher. One more line, ve'alahu lamali. So why do I need the who? Lichid Rav Huna Damarav, Dam Rav Huna Amarav, asham shenita klaraya v'shachto stam kasher. That if you have an asham that was set aside for grazing, but the owner died, and then what happened? Ultimately, you ended up shechting it without any particular designation. Ultimately, it's kasher. The Gemara says, nitak in, lo nitak lo. Only if it was actively set aside for grazing. My time, amakra, who, bahav yaso yehe. Because the pasuk says who, and therefore it remains in its designation until it is ultimately designated for grazing, at which point in time, even if you shechted it stam, ultimately the karban is going to be kasher. Bosai, shkoyach. Okay, shkoyach everyone. A little bit fast, I know. I will say that's why, stop. I will say that's a halach l'maaseh again. So just remember the three principles that ultimately, again, I gave you just like a few moments ago. That's the ikra of the entire daf. Those are the takeaways, and those are the principles that we're going to be using going forward. Bosai, tremendous. What a run. This wasn't even a sprint. This was a marathon. Shkoyach everyone. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a great day. Good Shabbos. Eretz Yisrael, Chevron, such as supposed to be able to learn with you all the time. You are now the majority. You're the majority, which is tremendous.
I'm gonna be back.
You don't want to be.
So,